public health emergency. That is what the U.S. president calls the opioid epidemic, and he's taking steps to curb the problem.
Only hatred. That's what a North Korean factory worker tells CNN she feels about the United States.
And bullets and tear gas. Election day turns violent in Kenya. Thanks for being with us, everyone. I'm Amra Walker.
And I'm Michael Holmes. Welcome to CNN Today. Welcome, everyone. The U.S. opioid epidemic is truly a scourge. There is no argument, political or otherwise, about that.
It kills, it destroys lives, families, and futures, and it is getting worse. U.S. President Donald Trump talked about it a lot on the campaign trail, and now he's taking action to fight it. But, as our Jeff Zeleny reports, critics say it isn't enough.
As Americans, we cannot allow this to continue.
President Trump declaring America's opioid crisis a public health emergency.
It is time to liberate our communities from this scourge of drug addiction. Never been this way. We can be the generation that ends the opioid epidemic. We can do it.
In the East Room of the White House today, the President and First Lady Melania Trump joining together to address a drug epidemic ravaging the country.
We are here today because of your courage. The opioid epidemic is affected more than 2 million Americans nationwide, and sadly, the number continues to rise.
The president's speech was a long-promised effort to deliver on a campaign pledge, but the memorandum he signed today does not call for new money to combat the opioid fight.
Effective today, my administration is officially declaring the opioid crisis a national public health emergency under federal law.
By calling the crisis a public health emergency rather than a national disaster, relief funds won't immediately be directed to the epidemic, as he suggested during these remarks in August.
It's a national emergency. We're going to spend a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of money on the opioid crisis.
The White House called it a distinction without a difference. And the president said he was committed to reining in the abuse of painkillers and heroin. He said the government would work toward finding a non-addictive painkiller to replace opioids and launch an advertising campaign to warn children to stay off drugs.
If we can teach young people and people generally not to start, it's really, really easy not to take them.
The president also grew reflective about his late brother Fred and his alcohol addiction.
I learned myself. I had a brother, Fred, great guy, best looking guy, best personality, much better than mine. But he had a problem. He had a problem with alcohol. And he would tell me, don't drink, don't drink. He was substantially older, and I listened to him, and I respected.
Craig Moss, who lost his son to a heroin overdose, supported Trump's bid for the presidency on his promises to crack down on the epidemic. Today, he said the president's pledge fell short.
I commend the president and the first lady for reaching out and addressing this issue and letting the struggling addicts of this country know that there's something going to be happening. But I certainly wish that he had spoken more about how he plans to attack the epidemic by not providing additional funding.
The president also renewed his call to build a wall on the border with Mexico to help block drugs from coming into the U.S.
An astonishing 90% of the heroin in America comes from south of the border, where we will be building a wall which will greatly help in this problem.
Meanwhile, today, the White House is looking ahead to trying to deliver on another campaign promise, cutting taxes. Big news, budget just passed, the president hailed on Twitter. The House passed a new budget today following the Senate last week, now paving the way for a full debate on tax reform.
Now, President Trump also says he will take up the issue of fentanyl trafficking with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Fentanyl is a drug that is more powerful than heroin.
It is cheap, it is easy to make, it is often lethal, and China is a major source of illicit fentanyl production.
The U.S. Postal Service and the Department of Homeland Security are strengthening the inspection of packages coming into our country to hold back the flood of cheap and deadly fentanyl, a synthetic opioid manufactured in China and 50 times stronger than heroin. And in 2 weeks, I will be in China with President Xi, and I will mention this as a top priority. And he will do something about it.
Well, many experts call the opioid epidemic the deadliest drug crisis in U.S. history. Drug overdoses are the leading cause of death for Americans under the age of 50.
Last year, overdoses killed more people than guns or car accidents. The most recent statistics show roughly 2% of deaths in the U.S. That's 1 in 50 were drug-related. Well, the statistics are certainly disturbing.
Yeah, but there are obviously real human faces behind them, and human stories tell us more about the impact of this epidemic than any studies could. Chief Medical Correspondent Dr. Sanjay Gupta talked to a pair of sisters about how they spiraled into addiction.
For Patricia Slavin, it all started 4 years ago with abdominal pain and a prescription for Dilaudid. It was the first time in her life she had ever taken an opiate.
They upped the dose, and it just kept to the point where I was taking a very high dose of pain. I had to get on pain management.
Every month they say, "How are you?" And I say, "Well, you know, it's not really helping as much. I'm still in a lot of pain." "Okay, well, add this to it, this pill, and then this patch."
Lisa Vinson, Patricia's younger sister, also had abdominal pain. Over the past 10 years, she's had 5 operations, including a hysterectomy. And yes, she also had lots and lots of narcotics.
I was torn between not being able to care for my family or, okay, I can take care of them if I just take some more pills.
Within months, 2 sisters, Lisa and Patricia, were both addicted to opioid painkillers. But things would soon turn even more desperate for Patricia.
Every time they give me more, my body just get immune to it. But then if I didn't have it, I get sick, real sick.
So what'd you do?
There was a guy that I worked with, his wife had Dilaudid, but she didn't like them, she didn't take them, so he would sell me what she had so that if I ran out, then I still had some.
But one day, that same guy didn't have any pills and offered up a cheaper alternative, heroin.
And the rest, as they say, is history. It just went downhill from there.
And Dr. Sanjay Gupta joining us now in studio for more on the U.S. opioid epidemic. And Sanjay, I mean, just listening to the stories of these 2 sisters, I mean, it sounds like these painkillers are such a dangerous drug. How do you go from, you know, using them as a painkiller, prescription painkiller, to becoming an addict?
Well, and it happened so quickly as well. I mean, Patricia hadn't even tried an opiate in her entire life prior to 4 years ago, and during 4 years she tried them, became addicted, went to heroin, and had this, you know, complete spiral out of control of her life, so it happens very fast. It's an addictive substance, and you keep in mind that opiate drugs, prescription opiate drugs, the same active ingredients as heroin. And what people say over and over again, as we've been reporting, after a while, you're not taking it to get high anymore. You're taking it to not feel terrible, because you just feel awful when you're not on it. So it's normalcy.
You know, the statistics that are staggering to me is, you know, you had 300 million prescriptions for pain meds written in 2015. 80% of opioids are consumed in the United States. Why on earth is that so? That doesn't happen in England. I mean, my son, you know my son, he had an ankle reconstruction. They threw like 3 weeks worth of one of these drugs at him.
Yeah.
And he ended up just using Advil or something like that.
Right,
because it's like, here.
It's an American-made problem. There's no question about it. And some of those classes of opiates, it's even higher. 90% of the world's supply are used in the United States. There was a cultural shift in this country, you know, a few decades ago, where all of a sudden, even in medical school, the adage was nobody should be in pain. Everybody comes in even for a flu or something, and they are shown that chart of smiley faces. Rate us your pain. And that became just a normal part of getting a patient's history and physical exam. So opiates became a really common thing. And the message being given was, there's no problem with them. There's not really a risk of addiction with them, so why not use them? We know that that was faulty thinking now.
So Is there a conversation in the medical industry to change things? Because we were just reporting last hour in many countries in Europe, for instance, opioids are a last-line treatment. Sure. So are we hearing about these kinds of conversations, changes need to be made?
Yeah, no question. You know, President Obama was doing that in his second term quite a bit, and also talking about even additional training that any doctor who's prescribing these medications has to go through. That's a bit of a controversial point. But the bottom line is exactly what you said, that the opiates in very, very rare situations would be a first-line therapy. There are many other things that should be tried before going to this, and the data doesn't show that they're that effective after a few days anyway, so why are people getting a 30-day supply?
Well, okay, call me a cynic. It is a $24 billion or something a year industry for the pharmaceutical companies. The pharmaceutical companies have lobbied Congress heavily to make it okay for these to be more easily dispensed, or at least not harder to dispense. It's a profit maker. It's a profit maker. What has to happen in just morally? Thinking has got to change.
Yeah, no question. And look, that's a common refrain, I think, in many areas of our intersection between politics and the economic sector. But here in particular, it's I think, probably come to that point now where you have a public health emergency, where you have the president saying certain drugs are evil. We're taking them completely off the market. You haven't heard these drugs being described by a president that way in the past. So it's starting to change. But you're right. That's been the uphill battle for a long time. These pharmaceutical companies have gotten very, very wealthy off of this, and they were part of the coordinated sort of effort to make these that much more accepted in this country. The American Pain Association, that sounds like a venerable organization you pay attention to, primarily funded by pharmaceutical dollars.
And quickly before we let you go, because President Trump declaring today this opioid epidemic a national health emergency, not a national disaster, what does this do in effect? How will it help opioid addicts?
It's tough to say, and you know, on one hand, it was quite extraordinary to hear him talking about this the way that he did. I think there are people who still woke up this morning and said, I'm sorry, it's that big a deal? I had no idea it was the #1 cause of unintentional death in America. More than car accidents and homicides combined, by the way. It's incredible. But it's not new money. It's not new federal dollars. It is a 90-day period of an emergency, not a year long, which is typically what emergencies are. He can renew it after that. But we're going to have to wait and see. We don't. He said a lot of the right things today. He struck a lot of the right chords. The problem was there was no details in terms of what that means. We've heard some of these things before.
Yeah, we have.
We got to see it actually follow through.
It's just massively profitable, and that's the problem in many ways.
Well, and the numbers are shocking. I mean, just how many people are affected by this.
Right. We heard what he said today. Let's see what happens.
Let's see what happens from here. Yeah, exactly. Sanjay Gupta, great to have you in studio. Thank you as always. Thank you. All right, we're going to turn now to some exclusive reporting from Niger. New information about the moments after the deadly ambush by ISIS fighters that left 4 U.S. soldiers dead.
Our Damon spoke to a Nigerian soldier whose unit was first on the scene after the attack. She joined us now from the capital. You hopefully got some answers a lot of people want to hear, along the lines of what happened.
Some answers, yes, Michael, although there are still a lot of questions. Now, when this soldier and his unit arrived on the scene, he was describing how the surviving Americans and Nigerians were standing back to back in defensive positions. Many of them, he said, were wounded. He described how he saw the bodies of 2 U.S. soldiers in the back of one of the U.S. vehicles. The body of a 3rd American was in the shrubs very close by, and then scattered a bit further away were the bodies of 3 Nigerian soldiers. Now, he was speaking to the wounded soldiers, and they told him that when the attack began, the convoy was separated. 2 of the vehicles, the front one sustaining gunfire, becoming split off from the rest. The attack starting out with about 8 vehicles, and then dozens of motorcycles, attackers arriving on motorcycles, effectively surrounding the Nigerians and the Americans from all sides. And that is when they began sustaining these really severe, heavy casualties. Now, this soldier said on the scene he didn't see any bodies of the attackers. The U.S. has said that they believe that they killed about 20 of these ISIS fighters. They do believe that it is an offshoot of ISIS, that has a group that has declared its allegiance to ISIS here in the region, that was responsible for this attack. But he did say that he did see traces of blood. He also noticed that some of the shrubs, the undergrowth, was still smoldering, and so he and his unit asked the villagers what had happened, if it was because of the explosives or the rocket-propelled grenades that caused the fire, and they said no, it was actually the attackers, as they were leaving, setting parts of the landscape on fire to create a smoke screen for themselves. Now, his unit and another unit overnighted at the location. They say that more Americans arrived by helicopter. This is after, of course, they evacuated the killed and the wounded, and they tried to scour the landscape using night vision capabilities, looking for the body of Sergeant LaDavid Johnson. They didn't find him at night. The next morning, the Nigerians, Americans later on arriving, began searching again. They were then notified by the village chief, who said that he believed that he knew where the location of the body was, and that is when they were able to recover it. Now, this soldier says that the unit, the American Green Berets and their Nigerian counterparts, actually stopped by his base the day before the attack. He didn't know where they were going. And then when they got the phone call to respond upon hearing that the Americans and the Nigerians had been ambushed, he said he was surprised, because when he saw the convoy at his base the day beforehand, he described it as being a light convoy, meaning that it was not sufficiently equipped when it comes to manpower and firepower. He was also expressing his surprise that they didn't have their own air assets, at least monitoring the unit as it was moving through this incredibly volatile terrain, because his own forces, when they go out, they at least take a force of about 80 to 100 soldiers with them. And this is an area that over the course of the last 2 years has really transited from having its main threat being banditry to now being terrorism.
So hearing all that, are you learning anything more about why U.S. intelligence would have deemed it unlikely that the Green Berets would have run into any enemy forces, knowing that ISIS had been operating in that area? Is this clearly just a U.S. intelligence failure?
And that is one of the key things that this investigation is going to be honing on, if and what actually went wrong in terms of assessing the risk factor. The U.S. soldiers who were out there were in unarmored vehicles. That is pretty standard practice in this region, given the mission. They also weren't wearing body armor. According to the soldier, they were in T-shirts. But that also is pretty standard practice, again, given the mission and also given their risk assessment. That, of course, is all going to have to be reviewed at this stage. But that was also one of the points that the soldier we were talking to and other sources were bringing up as well. This is an area where Nigerians regularly get attacked. Just last weekend, 13 Nigerian security forces were killed in the same zone. This is an area where there has been an increase of activity, especially on the part of this ISIS affiliate that's really trying to infiltrate a very disenchanted population there that has no real ties to the government and effectively feels abandoned by the powers that are in Niamey. So from the Nigerian perspective, it seems as if the U.S. did perhaps underestimate the threat level and underestimate perhaps the capabilities of the enemy, although this particular soldier we were talking to, it's important to say, did not know if it was simply a target of opportunity that presented itself or if this was some sort of pre-planned attack.
Incredible detail that you managed to get there, Awa, and obviously a long investigation ahead, but great reporting as always, Awa Damon there. Thank you.
Thank you, Arwa. Time to take a short break. When we come back, a day of ballots and bullets in Kenya.
Coming up, protesters and police clash as the deeply divided nation tries to stage a presidential election for the second time in 3 months. Plus, the Catalan leader walks back his talk on new elections.
This region's crisis deepening as it bids for its bid for independence falters. It has been a violent day of voting in the East African nation of Kenya. At least one person has been killed, several others wounded, as opposition protesters trying to shut down the vote clashed with heavily armed police.
It is Kenya's second presidential election in 3 months after the Supreme Court ruled the first vote was marred by irregularities. CNN's Farai Savenzo tells us from Kenya's capital that election officials say only 48% of eligible voters cast ballots in a deeply divided country.
At 93 years old, Josephine Wambui says she has voted in every presidential election since independence. And dressed in a Sunday best, she says this election day is no different, that it's her duty to have a say. But not everyone is as enthusiastic or convinced that their vote even matters. And it shows in the numbers. At this polling station in Kibera, an opposition stronghold, one election official told CNN not one vote was cast. Not one. Nearby, youth in the area clashed with police throughout the day. People here say they've listened to opposition leader Raila Odinga's calls to boycott a vote he says is illegal.
Our vote has been stolen several times. You vote, there's no change. And the only person whom we have hope in is Raila Odinga.
It was a different picture entirely in areas where support for the incumbent, Uhuru Kenyatta, is strong. CNN witnessed peaceful scenes like these in Kiambu County, north of Nairobi, where thousands gathered to vote.
I have a very good feeling about this day. It's a very special day for Kenyans, and mostly from this area. We know that we are going to get the best from this voting.
Because the opposition boycotted this election, it is widely expected that victory will be handed to President Uhuru Kenyatta. But a suspected low voter turnout would likely bring with it legal challenges and disputes about the legality of the vote.
Legitimacy will be a very, very big question that President Uhuru Kenyatta will be contending with. And also, of course, the issue of healing the nation, because it goes together.
Healing a nation so bitterly divided after a tumultuous and contentious election season will be no small feat. President Kenyatta must unite a nation, and likely he'll face new legal challenges. Farai Savenzo, CNN, Nairobi.
The crisis in Catalonia is taking a new turn. The leader of the wealthy Spanish region now backing away from a plan to call snap elections and will put the decision to his parliament.
But their jobs are on the line as a vote looms in Madrid. Aaron McLaughlin with more.
Michael and Amra, many moderate voices had hoped that Catalan President Carles Puigdemont would today call for a snap election. To many here, that was seen as a way out of this crisis, providing the necessary political room for Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy to soften his position on Article 155 of the Spanish Constitution, which would exert emergency rule over Catalonia. But that didn't happen today, and Puigdemont explained why he took the decision to instead rule out elections. Take a listen.
You know that I wanted to call for this election if we had certain guarantees that would allow their celebration in a period of normality. There are no guarantees to justify today the calling for elections in the parliament. My obligation was to try honestly and loyally to avoid an impact on our institutions of the application of Article 155, like the Council of Ministers, and likely to be approved in the Senate.
Puigdemont said that Catalonia's response to Article 155 now rests with the Catalan Parliament, which debated the matter today. That session has been suspended, expected to continue tomorrow. At the end of the session tomorrow, they could vote to formally declare independence. Meanwhile, in Madrid, the Senate is expected to vote to approve Article 155, which effectively means they're going ahead with emergency rule. It would also mean that on Saturday, Puigdemont and his entire government would be sacked. Amra and Michael?
Aaron McLaughlin, thank you. They are two iconic questions Americans have debated now for almost 54 years. Who killed President John F. Kennedy and why?
America's 35th president was, of course, gunned down on November 22nd, 1963, as he drove in a motorcade in Dallas, Texas. Now, moments ago, U.S. President Donald Trump ordered the release of thousands of the final government files on the assassination. But He says he is withholding some of them out of national security, law enforcement and foreign affairs concerns.
Clint Hill was in Dallas that tragic day. He is a Secret Service agent who you see here jumping on the back of Kennedy's car. Our Wolf Blitzer spoke with Philip Sheenan, the author of the book A Cruel and Shocking Act, and with Hill about what they hope to find in the files.
Well, perhaps within them we'll find out the motive or answer the question why. That's one of the more important things to myself and to others. The other thing is that the more material they hold back, the more suspicious people become that they're hiding something. And I don't think they need to do that. I think that every bit of information they have should be released.
Philip, what are you looking for? Well, I'm looking for information that suggests that the government knew a lot more about this man, Lee Harvey Oswald, than it ever wanted to admit. That it looks like they had a lot of information that suggested Oswald was a threat, and if they'd acted on it, maybe the president would have survived his trip to Dallas.
All right, going to take a short break here on the program. When we come back, inside North Korea, growing anger and hatred over crippling new sanctions.
Anti-U.S. propaganda is everywhere, even in its factories.
In fact, it reads, let's tear apart the mentally deranged U.S. President Donald Trump.
Welcome back, everyone, to CNN Today. I'm Amara Walker.
And I'm Michael Holmes. Time to update you on the top stories. And the U.S. President Donald Trump has declared the opioid epidemic a public health emergency.
That means federal agencies will provide more grant money to fight it. Mr. Trump made the announcement at the White House earlier, saying we can be the generation that ends the epidemic. A just-released United Nations investigation is pointing the finger at the Syrian government for a deadly sarin gas attack last April. 2 UN diplomats telling CNN the panel has concluded that it is confident Bashar al-Assad's regime was behind the attack on a rebel-held village that killed dozens of civilians. Syria has consistently denied that. In Kenya, presidential election day clashes between police and opposition protesters have left at least one person dead and several others wounded. Officers fired live bullets and tear gas at rock-throwing demonstrators. But across most of the country, voting was peaceful. It was a rerun of Kenya's disputed August election, which the nation's Supreme Court ruled was marred with irregularities. The U.S. Treasury Department is slapping new sanctions on the Hermit Kingdom over human rights abuses.
And now North Korea says its sports teams are also being targeted. This all following the UN ban on Pyongyang's textile exports, which was imposed last month. Will Ripley is back in Pyongyang, North Korea, for us, and you've been looking into this, Will. What did you find in these factories?
Well, you know, it's interesting because these sanctions, in large part, the new Treasury Department sanctions 7 individuals, 3 North Korean entities. These are focused on human rights violations. And one of the things they mention is censorship and the secret police basically cracking down on anybody who expresses dissent in this country. But when we went to this factory, it was truly remarkable to see how here in North Korea, dissent is not even an option for the people who live here.
From the moment we arrive at this Pyongyang textile mill, anti-American propaganda greets us at nearly every turn. Outside, missiles are blowing up the U.S. Capitol. Inside, a personal attack on North Korea's public enemy #1.
This propaganda banner says that the workers are motivated by their burning hatred for the United States. And in fact, it reads, let's tear apart the mentally deranged U.S. President Donald Trump.
The spin doesn't stop there. If the looms weren't so loud, you'd hear the patriotic music blaring over loudspeakers, rousing around 8,000 workers at this sprawling model factory. UN sanctions added textiles to the long list of banned North Korean exports, cutting off $700 million in annual revenue for the regime. A huge blow to the economy, but only a minor inconvenience, says the factory's chief engineer. He says sanctions will only make them try harder. The worker we're here to interview has been carefully chosen by our government guides. Moon Gang-soon is considered a labor heroine.
What do you think about Americans and the United States in general?
Only hatred. It makes me shudder, she says. After hearing the absurd remarks from Trump, saying he'll destroy our country, it makes me think you are also part of them. Moon grew up in dormitories like this. 7 women share each room, sleeping, bathing, and eating together. They live collectively until they get married. This new facility, a model for the rest of the country. It's clear not all North Korean workers live like this. We're taken to Moon's spacious 3-bedroom apartment in Pyongyang. She lives here with her husband and 2 children. Here, we learn why she was chosen to speak with us. Moon is a ranking member of the ruling Workers' Party of Korea. She was even a delegate at leader Kim Jong-un's party Congress. Only the most loyal, dedicated North Koreans ever reach such a prestigious post. They're rewarded with the good life by Pyongyang standards. Moon met her husband at the factory. Kim Hyuk served 10 years in the Korean People's Army. They hope their 4-year-old son will grow into a loyal soldier. Their 14-month-old daughter, a model worker, just like mom. They tell me they want their children to live in peace, but say they are not afraid of war. Echoing the propaganda at their factory, they say North Korea will fiercely defend its right to exist at any cost.
The mindset here is so dramatically different in many ways from other countries. You have parents sitting across from me in their living room, tenderly holding their children who clearly they love and care about, but yet also saying that they would rather see their children die in a nuclear war if that meant that a war would result in the end of North Korea. They say they wouldn't want their families to live in a world without North Korea. Really, the country here is above all else, even one's own family. We know that the U.S. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis is in South Korea right now meeting with his counterparts, trying to go over the strategy to counter North Korea's nuclear program. And, of course, President Trump arrives here in the region in just over a week. Michael and Emerald?
And we'll have to ask you, because you talk about the North Korean mindset. Do North Koreans really believe that they would be able to win a war with the U.S.?
There is a swagger here. There's a confidence I sense more strongly now than I've sensed during previous discussions, not only with regular people, but also with government officials earlier this week. They feel that if there was a nuclear conflict, that North Korea could not only survive, but could perhaps emerge victorious. And they feel that way because they see the images on state TV of missile after missile, successful test after successful test. In this country where the message is carefully controlled, the goal is to rally the nation behind their supreme leader, Kim Jong-un, who has gone all in developing his country's nuclear capability, which they really believe, they say, will keep the peace in this region, which of course is counterintuitive to many others who feel that by bolstering the nuclear arsenal, North Korea is adding to the instability and uncertainty in what is already a very tense time.
Definitely a very unique mindset, to say the least. Well, Ripley, we appreciate you. Thank you so much. Live for us there in Pyongyang.
Great reporting as always. Thanks, Will. Well, meanwhile, the top U.S. general is in Seoul right now to talk about military options for dealing with North Korea.
Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Joseph Dunford, says they'll discuss South Korea's request for more powerful weapons, as well as ways to boost their cyber defenses. Now, Dunford says the more South Korea can do for itself, the better, and the more effective the deterrence against North Korea.
The U.S. State Department has finally issued guidance on which Russian individuals and entities will be subject to new sanctions 25 days after they were due.
The October 1st notice was required by new legislation recently passed by Congress. It is meant to put potential stakeholders, including U.S. companies, on alert before the law is implemented in January.
Lawmakers from both parties wanted to know why the Trump administration had missed the deadline and whether the delay reflected reluctance from the White House to further sanction Moscow. Still to come here on the program, new security measures go into place for some U.S.-bound flights.
Why you could end up answering some extra questions at the airport. Well, new security measures are now in effect for all U.S.-bound flights.
The move follows a ban on laptops by the Trump administration that has since been lifted on flights originating from certain countries. Sarah Gannam explains what the new rules will mean for airline passengers.
Put it simply, this is a way to address looming terror threats against passenger airlines without putting into place that wildly unpopular laptop ban. Starting today, airlines traveling in from overseas airports must implement these extra security measures, or they risk triggering a laptop ban, or worse, a ban on certain flights coming into the United States. These extra measures were announced over the summer by Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly after speaking to the airlines about a way to avoid the laptop ban, and after concerns about lithium-ion batteries inside of laptops all being together in the belly of the aircraft. This could really start to change the way that we view traditional airport security. Here's what you're going to start seeing. Greater scrutiny of passengers, which could begin at the ticket counter, enhanced screening of electronic devices, and better deployment of canines that detect explosives. This will affect more than 100 countries, 180 airlines, more than 2,000 daily flights coming into the United States. And when these measures were announced, Secretary Kelly said they were necessary to thwart terror plots to blow up passenger planes. He said this is an attempt to make it harder for the terrorists to succeed. Sarah Gannam, CNN, Newark.
All right, and we're just getting confirmation now on something we've been waiting for several hours. The National Archives officially releasing the Kennedy assassination records. Now, we thought this would happen, what, about 4 hours ago now?
Yeah. So we're talking about 2,800 records that are being released, but this is not a full release. President Trump is actually withholding some files and keeping it secret. There was some intelligence and security concerns that were raised, and so that is being looked into right now.
I think originally it was 100,000 documents that may well have been let go and released, and it's been 25 years in the waiting for these documents. It was decided 25 years ago this is the last day that they had to be released. And there was also a lot of concern, or a lot of questions about why security services waited until basically the last minute to make objections to some of these documents being released. In fact, a large number of them being released, and that'll probably give the conspiracy theorists a little bit
Well, the whole point of this law
fodder
from 1992 was to quell the conspiracy theories and to clear things up. But obviously now that thousands, tens of thousands of documents are going to be withheld and kept secret for now, that's obviously going to just fuel more speculation and curiosity and more conspiracy.
But everyone's going through what has been released, and we will bring you that when we get it. Now, you can follow more of our stories, meanwhile, on Facebook, facebook.com/CNN Today. A lot of feature reports and interviews there.
Also, you can follow us on Twitter @CNN Today, @HomeCNN, @AMRA CNN. Thanks for watching. I'm Amra Walker.
I'm Michael Holmes. World Sport coming up next.